Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Cliona Raleigh, and I'm the President and CEO at ACLED, which is the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Organization. It's the leading source of data on global conflict, and I will be moderating today's session on our report on the Rwandan Defence Forces and their operations abroad. Today, we are discussing this recent report and how their operations have signaled a shift in Rwanda's regional standing. It's, of course, a subject of great interest, especially to our colleagues and partners across Africa. We are joined today, thankfully, by the report's authors, Dr. Lad Serwat, who is ACLED's regional specialist, and Peter Boffin, a senior research coordinator in ACLED, having spent a very long time living in Tanzania. And together they will focus on and walk us through some of the report's findings. Lad in particular works on the Great Lakes region, and Peter, of course, has been focused on Cabo Delgado's Conflict Observatory, which tracks political violence in northern Mozambique. We also have the pleasure of hosting a group of expert panelists. Dr. Alex Vines is a research director at Chatham House and has led Chatham House Africa program since 2002. Previously, he held roles at Chatham House as Director for Regional Studies and International Security and Director for Area Studies and International Law. And he, I can say with authority, knows almost everything there is to know about African security. Fernando Lima is the editor of Zitamar News and has been a journalist since 1976. And he has extensively covered the conflict in Mozambique. He's currently finishing a PhD in agricultural policy in Mozambique after independence and is a resident commentator on 2 Mozambican television channels. And we welcome him. And with that, I will pass this over to Alex to start us off. And Alex is in Mozambique and he has graciously joined us for this chat. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much. So yes, my name is Alex Vines and I'm in Maputo at the moment in Mozambique. And hello, everybody. So this is a great paper to be discussing the Rwandan Defence Force and how its operations have changed over time. So this is an important contribution both to the policy and academic literature. So there are a few pieces around of which I think are building blocks to this excellent piece of work. There was a strategic comment by the International Institute for Strategic Studies published in October 2022. There's also a really good article by a US government defense analyst who got permission to write the article in the Journal of Southern African Studies on the sources of Rwandan military effectiveness in Cabo Delgado. I'm not going to talk much about Cabo Delgado, but the Ralph Shield paper in JSAS, the Journal of March this year, I do highly recommend. I want to just make a few points of Rwanda in Africa. The first, the Rwandans have been looking at being a major provider of security support on the continent for coming out now for 2 decades. So it started in 2005 when Rwanda began to contribute military and police officers to UN operations, and has simply since then over the decades really ramped up its contributions. By June 2022, it was the 4th largest contributor to US peacekeeping operations worldwide and the largest in sub-Saharan Africa, with more than twice as many soldiers as the 2nd largest, which is Ghana. So this is an important business model for Rwanda, which is exporting security provision. I had the privilege last year to be in the UN Security Council. I was assisting the Mozambican government during their presidency in the council, and there was a debate on silencing the guns. And the Rwandan foreign minister was there. It was an open debate. And the foreign minister talked about that traditional UN peacekeeping missions were over, that there needed to be pragmatic approaches. And then he advertised Mozambique and Central African Republic as countries that Rwanda had performed well. He also said that Rwanda receiving European peace facility fundings was particularly effective in in assisting this process. So the discussion about money is really an important part of the whole business model. So it was interesting being in the council because the Russian ambassador had just been previously discussing how Russia had its own solution to Africa's security problems. And ACLED has written widely about what was known as Wagner and now the Africa Corps, and that was what he was promoting. And the Rwandans actually were saying in the council under the Mozambique presidency that Wagner was not the solution, that there needed to be African tailor-made pragmatic solutions to African security problems. And so you could actually see a bit of tension between the Rwandan offer and what Moscow, the Russians, were offering in that council debate. There are new markets for the Rwandans. They are active in traditional peacekeeping operations. I've mentioned Central African Republic. I've mentioned Mozambique in particular. They have been looking for market entry into, for example, to Benin. Some of you may remember in September 2022, the spokesperson for Benin's President Patrice Talon announced that the country was seeking a logistical and military assistance agreement with Rwanda and Benin. Now, that hasn't necessarily matured in the way that the Rwandans foresaw, for the simple reason that despite a very close relationship, even emotionally, between the Talon administration and President Kagame in Rwanda, the regional community, ECOWAS, does not welcome foreign militaries into the region. Now, of course, that's complicated by the fragmentation of ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, with the military juntas now bringing military assistance from Russia, for example. But it is an example of the politics within Africa, even, of where the Rwandans can go and can't go. Now, there's going to be a lot more conversation shortly, and my presentation has to be very short, which is that, of course, what I think we are also seeing is that Rwanda is using these contributions to security in Mozambique or Central African Republic and elsewhere as offsetting for the controversies of what Rwanda is engaged with its near abroad, particularly Eastern Congo, and the allegations of its support for M23. The paper by ACLED is very clear on this. And what I would just like to say is my own view is that everybody has an interest in the DRC, and you've even seen the positioning of neighboring countries who have been involved in Eastern Congo, like Uganda, like Kenya, and like Rwanda. And this is less about security, and this is more about resource extraction. So we will hear a lot more on other dynamics of this, but I want to just contextualize that Rwanda is not unique in terms of the way that it looks at a weaker Democratic Republic of Congo and looks at what economic advantage it can get. Final point, and then I will hand over to the speakers, but I think that the resurrection of the M23 as a kind of Frankensteinian effective group in Eastern Congo, one of the drivers for its reappearance, having been in abeyance for over a decade, was the discussion of building an effective transport corridor through Uganda from Eastern Congo. And that was something that additionally concerned those in Kigali. So business is also part of part of this business model and the economics of it. Having said that, I myself have been in northern Mozambique trying to see what the problems are of the Rwandan deployment there. And the message I got and get is that Mozambicans wish that the defense and security forces of Mozambique were as disciplined and as professional and spoke local languages like Swahili as effectively as the Rwandans do. So this is a complicated narrative. My time is up. I hand back to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Alex. A lot of things for us to think through. Lad and Peter, I will hand this over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And, I think Alex really situated a lot of this conversation well. If I could have the first slide, please. I think really where a lot of this discussion started, where this research started was, as Alex mentioned, initially investigating Wagner's involvement in Central African Republic. And it's in Central African Republic that Rwandan special forces also deployed under bilateral arrangements. They're also the largest contributor to the UN peacekeeping operation there. So this was really where we started looking more into Rwanda's bilateral arrangements and kind of where this research started back in 2020. But also speaking to this other trend that we see rising criticism against multilateralism and the search for alternative security arrangements. And I think with the conversation around Wagner and private security, with Rwanda and numerous others involved in bilateral arrangements for military forces, even the equipping of local communities as self-defense groups. I think this all sort of fits into this criticism and various security gaps that are being filled by alternative arrangements than we've seen in the past. So we have seen Rwanda involved in sort of multilateralism for quite some time, beginning with their AU contributions in 2004 and then with the UN in 2005. They have also deployed a number of times into DRC, I mean, throughout the Congo Wars and the 2000s, but in 2020, I think we saw this sort of shifting and changing with their deployments to CAR and Mozambique. And then more recently, sort of the bulk of their operations actually shifting towards the DRC alongside the M23. If I could have the next slide, please. So I think what we really saw was this kind of rise in the contribution of peacekeepers with their multilateral operations expanding to a number of countries throughout Africa. Sometimes this would overlap with their bilateral mandates, as we saw in CAR. And I think importantly, even recently, is that Rwanda has often utilized their large contributions to peacekeeping operations as political capital. Sometimes when facing criticism for involvement in the DRC, for example, they threatened to withdraw peacekeepers and kind of use this sort of jockeying back and forth as leverage. Next slide, please. And what we have been talking about quite a lot and what we focus on in this report is their sort of bilateral military agreements. And this sort of began quite early. There's a number of discussions over the last few decades, but the operations began in CAR in late 2020 when the country was facing a rebel offensive. This kind of expanded into Mozambique in 2021 to counter the insurgency there. But these sort of agreements offer a lot further flexibility. The mandates are a bit different than the peacekeeping operations, so they're able to engage in these military operations in a different way. They don't have the same restrictions that peacekeepers do. And I don't think it's any secret that this kind of comes with an increase in economic and political engagement. I mean, these are seems quite straightforward in Rwanda's foreign policy documents that as they engage in these security arrangements, this also comes with sort of supporting Rwandan businesses in the region, in a sort of rise in the number of diplomatic visits, in sort of embassies and a sort of political maneuvering as well. But this has also come with some strains to the partnerships that they've engaged in. So as they've engaged with alongside Wagner in the Central African Republic, they were quite quick to point out the human rights violations of Wagner and even threatened to cease their operations in that context. They also have, quite a interesting relationship, I'd say, with SADC because they're supposed to be fighting alongside that mission in Mozambique, but in DRC, they were supporting M23, so they were actually working against SADC at the same time, but in these two different contexts. Next slide, please. And as I had mentioned, Rwanda had, I mean, in the Kagame era, been quite involved in DRC through unilateral deployments throughout the Congo Wars. And even though the number of kind of the levels of conflict declined in the 2000s, we also saw a number of kind of more ad hoc deployments, most of these against various armed groups, with shifting kind of relations with Congolese forces. Sometimes they were operating alongside, other times against. And then we've also seen kind of ongoing border skirmishes, I would say, with Burundi and Uganda. Not that they've been nearly as involved in either of those two contexts as they have in DRC, but they have strained relations with their northern and southern neighbors. I think we've seen border closures, we've seen limitations to commerce, we've seen challenges for civilians to move between countries with some of these tensions between Burundi and Uganda. So turning to the next slide, we can kind of get into what we look at initially with the unilateral deployments into DRC. So the majority of this engagement, and this is focused specifically since 2022, have been battles against other armed groups. That's comprised 81% of the total events. We've definitely seen a growth in operations that, from 2022 and 2023, there was around 60 events involving the RDF directly in DRC. And then this is more than doubled so far in 2024. And I think important to note that this really escalated in the first part of the year, but since the peace agreements in Angola, this has really declined. So since July, we've actually seen a drop in the RDF's direct engagement. One kind of concerning trend is that we have noticed a rise in the number of shelling and artillery strikes. So this has been both directly deployed by the RDF as well as equipping the M23. The vast majority are indeed sort of artillery strikes, but we've also seen other sort of more heavy weapon provisions with drones, with surface-to-air missiles, anti-tank grenade launchers, and some advanced equipment to jam drones as well. And so while Rwanda has indeed been very careful to guard against sort of violence against civilians in their multilateral peacekeeping operations and their bilateral missions, they've gained a reputation for this, as Alex mentioned, but their sort of increased use of remote violence in the DRC this year has really come with a toll on civilians, that's escalated the number of cases in which civilians were targeted. Could I have the next slide, please? And so with much of this, they have been operating alongside the M23 since 2022. The vast majority of their operations are with them. We don't see a lot of activity outside of this, although we do have some cases of partnership with the Congo River Alliance. This is relatively small, around a dozen events alongside the Congo River Alliance, but the vast majority being with the M23. The big difference that I just want to draw out is that for much of Rwanda's involvement since the Congo Wars, they've primarily clashed against the FDLR in DRC. That's been over half of their operations up until the beginning of 2022. Other events, they occasionally have contested against local Mai militias and sometimes the military forces there. But what's really shifted has been kind of the combat against the Congolese military forces, now comprising over half of their operations, with the majority of the rest of their operations against Wazalendo. So we see a lot of rhetoric from Rwanda kind of against the FDLR and justifying their deployment there. But the FDLR are actually less than 1% of the events since the beginning of 2022. So their involvement with the FDLR has been fairly minimal. And just a bit of a caveat with that we go into detail in the report is that We do know that some FDLR have joined the Congolese military. We know some are kind of under the Wazalendo alliance. So, while they're not directly against the FDLR, FDLR have sort of joined the military, Wazalendo in some cases. But that's also a dangerous precedent to equate all of the Congolese military, all of Wazalendo with FDLR. This sort of sets up an argument for Rwanda to, combat all of the military at this point. So something that I find a bit concerning. Next slide, please. And then looking geographically at the RDF's deployment, we see that, kind of into 2022, they initially moved into Rutshuru and then southward towards Goma, although not reaching Goma on the RN2. In 2023, this kind of moved inwards into North Kivu, and then for much of this year, moving southward and sort of surrounding much of Goma. And this has really allowed the RDF to control a number of strategic roadways, as you can see on this map. That's allowed for them to tax a number of economic goods moving throughout the region, limit the military supplies to Goma. And then it's also allowed for the capture of a number of strategic mining sites. So I think with that, although brief, and I hope you have the opportunity to read through the full report, I'll hand it over to Peter.
Thank you very much, Lad. Our second case study is quite a contrast to operations in DRC, Mozambique. It's a window on one aspect of wider Rwandan foreign policy practice, and it can also help us understand other bilateral operations that Rwanda is undertaking, as well as other bilateral operations that we see in East Africa that other countries are involved in, such as Uganda and DRC, or Tanzania, also itself in Mozambique with its own bilateral force. So I will be highlighting the importance of how the deployment came about, aspects of the deployment on the ground, and particular interests that may be underpinning the deployment. Slide, please. So the Mozambique mission is significant, with currently 4,000 troops in country. That compares to between 5,000 and 6,000 on multilateral missions currently in Africa, and the 3,000 to 4,000 estimated by Security Council appointed experts to be in the DRC. So this is a big deal. Operations have been flexible. 1/3 of operations that we've recorded have been in the past 9 months, and 2/3 of this year's operations have been since July. Those two facts reflect the departure of SADC's mission in Mozambique in the middle of the year and the uptick in the insurgency since the beginning of 2024. The flexibility and speed of deployment, which makes some countries favor bilateral operations, doesn't happen by magic. It takes years for things to be in place for it to happen. In the case of Mozambique, arguably it started in 2016 with President Kagame's visit to Maputo. That led to the establishment of a joint permanent commission in 2018. That's a mechanism for formal exchanges at technical and political level between governments. And President Nyusi's visit to Kigali the same year, 1 year into the insurgency. So when Palma was attacked in March 2021, threatening control of the north of the province and threatening the Total Energies-led LNG project near the town, things were in a position to move pretty quickly. The following month in April, President Nyusi was in Kigali to discuss the situation with President Kagame. In May, Presidents Kagame, Nyusi, and Ramaphosa of South Africa were in Paris for an African Investment Summit hosted by President Macron. Kagame met Ramaphosa to try and get the all clear of SADC, and Nyusi met Macron, who promised support, counter-terrorism support. Parallel to that, in the region, Rwanda's then Chief of Defence Forces, General Jean Bosco Kazura, and then Inspector General of Police Dan Manyuza met their counterparts in Tanzania to try and address their concerns. So by the end of May 2021, there was a Rwandan reconnaissance team in Cabo Delgado, and 2 months later, the first 1,000 troops arrived. Such missions can deploy quickly, but it took 5 years to get there. And it's important to have a sense of that, as that these complex relationships do affect operations on the ground. A slide, please. On scope first, the efforts of RDF and the multilateral SADC mission in Mozambique have contributed significantly to shrinking Islamic State Mozambique and its insurgency, reducing its threat to the state and its threat to the people of Cabo Delgado themselves. Operations are broadly reflected on the map. An initial focus in 2021 on securing the oil town of Palma and the nearby port of Mocimboa de Praia, and then significant operations in a number of districts as Islamic State Mozambique fighters dispersed. By mid-2022, RDF's focus was on maintaining control of Palma and Mocimboa de Praia, though a contraction in Islamic State Mozambique activity didn't really come until 2023. By 2024, we've seen a significant increase in RDF operations concentrated against Islamic State Mozambique positions in Macomia district, filling the gap left by SADC's departure. I'll come back to them as we look at issues of posture. Coordination is there's been limited operational collaboration with SADC, which deployed at the same time in July, August 2021. In ACLED, we've recorded just 7 joint RDF SAMIM operations, a figure that reflected an unpublished assessment of by the government of Mozambique. So does this reflect poor coordination? At first, I thought possibly it did, but I think you can look at it differently. The deployment has required considerable political and diplomatic skills from force commanders on the ground for 3 reasons. The first reason is Tanzania. The Tanzania People's Defence Force was part of the SADC mission, but now has its own bilateral force in Cabo Delgado, close to the border, and has troops on its own side of the border. RDF is not a military threat to Tanzania, but it is it's an incursion. Its presence is an incursion into Tanzania's historical sphere of influence over Mozambique. Lad mentioned DRC. From late relation to SADC, and from late 2023, SADC forces, including Tanzanian and South African troops and Rwandan forces, have been on opposite sides of the M23 conflict in DRC. So that requires careful management. And thirdly, within Mozambique itself, RDF's sort of professionalism is in contrast to that of host government forces. RDF has been, for example, viewed as an avenue of appeal in the case of host government security forces' abuses of civilians, something that places RDF commanders in a difficult position potentially difficult position with their host government. And I'd argue it's unlikely that RDF commanders would have had any success without successfully managing this very complex set of issues and relationships. In terms of doctrine and posture, this is where there's a really big contrast with DRC. RDF's approach in Mozambique has been to use well-trained infantry working in smaller formations, very limited use of air assets, no artillery, and essentially taking a not entirely different approach to the Mozambican armed forces, but just doing it a hell of a lot better, much better trained troops, much more skilled troops, and on a skills level that is just completely on a different scale compared to Islamic State Mozambique. So this sort of underpins their effectiveness. A significant element of their approach has been RDF's emphasis on civilian protection and peacekeeping. In ACLED, we've recorded just 2 incidents of violence targeting civilians since 2021. I think it was in 2021 and 2023. Rwanda's role in the development of the broad internationally accepted Kigali principles on the protection of civilians possibly helps explain this. The principles encourage a counterinsurgency posture that seeks sort of community engagement in patrolling practices and restraint in combat during peacekeeping operations. However, the withdrawal of salmon forces in 2024 has led to a more aggressive approach to Islamic State Mozambique. An example of this was the introduction of attack helicopters in Makomia district at the end of July, again in August and again in September, operating in areas where we know civilians are either living or visiting regularly, and thereby potentially compromising Rwanda's commitment to civilian safety. Slide, please. Yeah, finally back to interests, the political economy, development political economy in quite a simplistic sense. These operations are costly. One estimate puts it at about $500 million per year. That's a crude estimate. Rwandan military budgets are not open, not available. Similar, just like Tanzania, unlike South Africa. The only known additional financial support for the operation has come from the Council of the European Union, which approved 20 million euros in December 2022. Renewal of this support in 2024 seems to have met some resistance in some European capitals, but according to a report yesterday, maybe edging towards approval. One way of balancing the costs is through commercial engagement of Rwandan firms, and this happens at all levels. One Rwandan firm with controlled by Crystal Ventures, a Rwanda Patriotic Front associated holding company, has won a reasonably significant security contract for the LNG project site. At the same time, you've a host of SMEs. Recently, a very small fishing boat was hijacked by Islamic State Mozambique, held for 2 or 3 days. We understand through our network and coming together, there was actually one of the boats hijacked was actually owned by a small Rwandan businessman operating in Mozambique prior. So it's happening at all levels. There can also be domestic benefits. In January 2022, Total Energies agreed to open a permanent office in Rwanda and to collaborate in new renewable energy projects there. There are political interests that Mozambique is interested to pursue. In 2024, Mozambique finally approved an extradition agreement with Rwanda, something that the Mozambique Law Society saw as being linked to Rwandan concerns over the presence of Rwandan opposition figures in the country. And finally, counterinsurgency in Mozambique is relevant to Rwanda's own security. Since its inception, the insurgency has been connected to violent jihadist networks across East Africa. Over the years, this has grown into formal and active relationship with Islamic State affiliates, with Islamic State itself and its affiliates in the region, including Islamic State in Somalia, which is becoming increasingly important for an increasingly important affiliate for in supporting Islamic State operations across the continent. Its involvement in Mozambique improves access to intelligence about those networks, as well as directly countering them. So all in all, there's a lot for Mozambique's next president to consider.
Thanks, Peter.
Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for having me. I will give you some additional points in order to have Rwandan intervention in Mozambique into context. And I would go back again to 2021, and when the need for external forces in Mozambique was being discussed within SADC. And it should be also very clear that Mozambique was, when I say Mozambique, I would say Mozambican government was not too happy to have one, foreign forces, two, especially SADC forces in Mozambique. But on the other way, it was very embarrassing for the Mozambican government to entertain the Wagner Group in 2019, and also another mercenary group coming from South Africa between 2020 and 2021, the DAG advisory group, which was operating with a small fleet of helicopters and not being very effective militarily. Also because a number of Mozambican partners were telling quite clear to Mozambique that they cannot come to Mozambique to support Mozambique while Mozambique was entertaining these relations with mercenary groups, which others would call private armies. So I think I would say that Rwandan arrival in Mozambique in July 2021 was not option B as an alternative to SADC forces, but plan A as to counterbalance the presence of SADC forces in Mozambique, and specifically in Cabo Delgado. And you will notice that the forces, the foreign forces and foreign contingents were allocated on regional basis in Cabo Delgado, and Rwanda was allocated the districts of Palma and Mucimo da Praia, exactly the districts where major action was taking place, developing the gas industry there, where also they were planning all these gas trains for liquefaction of gas being extracted from Rovuma Basin. In addition to the force allocated to these two districts, along I would say that in a first deployment, Rwanda achieved a total of 1,500 soldiers. 200 soldiers were specifically allocated to the camp of Afungi, where Total was located and working together with a special Mozambican force known by the label of JTF, and being subsidized by the oil companies operating in Cabo Delgado. One of the expectations about Rwandan presence was their capacity to bring results very fast, since we were or there was this problem of Palma being attacked in March 21, which have forced Total to withdraw and to suspend its project. And in fact, RDF, a month after the arrival in Cabo Delgado, they occupy Mucimo da Praia, which is a very strategic port, as Peter had emphasized, and that was for 1 year, almost 1 year, under control by ISIS, Mozambique. One of the things that people were commenting was how come that Rwanda came from a so far place, come to Mozambique and to interact with the local population. And so, as Alex emphasized prior in his intervention, to the surprise of a lot of Mozambicans not very knowledgeable about Rwandan forces and Cabo Delgado, they were able not to speak Portuguese, but to speak Kiswahili with most of the population of Cabo Delgado that understand Kiswahili. And this was a major blow, or a major positive effect in terms of war, violence, and relations with the local population. And we are under this kind of ironic situation in which the local population, when they have problems of brutality, of human rights abuses, instead of going to the local authorities or to the Mozambican security forces, they go first to the Rwandese force to present their complaints. This element, it doesn't happen just because of the language element. Since the beginning, Rwandese were very smart in entertaining very good and close relations with the elders, with the local leaders, traditional leaders. So having this kind of mixed intelligence and I would say important people network in order to maintain a good relation with the population. In addition to that, and despite the problems that have been referred here in coordinating actions with the SADC forces, also there were problems in coordinating activities with the Mozambican armed forces. But Rwandans were smart enough to work with a force called Força Local, which is a local militia. They were pretty good in fighting, and they were also good tractors and very knowledgeable about the region. And so they provide very good intelligence and very good knowledge about the field in which the Rwandans were operating. The other things in terms of arts and minds, Rwandan operation in Cabo Delgado, I would say that they were also building schools and markets which attract good, I would say, positive feeling in Cabo Delgado, but ironically, again, attracting a lot of criticism from the elites in Maputo. I would say that this criticism of Rwandan involvement in social activities, it's not because they were Rwandans, but because these have been used as a tool against the outgoing president, Philippe Nyusi. There was a lot of criticism of the current president, and attacking the Rwandan presence is one of the ways to attack President Philippe Nyusi. Since June-July 2023, it was clear in Mozambique and within the SADC region that SADC forces will not be maintained in Mozambique for a much longer period, and it was decided that Samim should leave in 2024. So in December that year, Nyusi went up to Kigali and planned with Paul Kagame the extension of the Rwandan force, including the reinforcement of the Rwandan force to replace Samim. In April this year, 2024, there was a meeting of Frelimo's Central Committee, which is the kind of one of the bodies of the ruling party. And those members were briefed on the aftermath of Samim presence in Mozambique. And they were informed that the government had decided to maintain Rwanda, to maintain Tanzania as a bilateral force. And in according with, they immediately start planning the operation that is going on at present in Makumia district in order to overcome to deal with the shortcomings with the Samim force that never managed to eliminate insurgency in Makumia district. This was a kind of also an indirect criticism of the South African force based in Makumia that never managed to do efficient military operations in the southern banks of Misalo River, which is the southern part of Makumia district. This operation have started in early August, and as Peter have mentioned, for the first time you have Air Force artillery being used, and also naval forces being used. A number of units from EU trained forces, troops from Mozambique are also participating in these, I would say, cleanup operations in Makumia district. I would say in relation to Makumia, I would say it's important to say that early in the year, there was pressure, I would say, from the military in Mozambique to use Air Force and air bombing in Makumia district in order to dismantle ISIS bases there. And the government of Mozambique at a very high level did not authorize those operations. So the current operation in Makumia have been in an early stage. Civilian authorities encourage the population living in southern Makumia in the coastal areas to withdraw from those areas and to get to Makumia headquarters in order to eventually prevent significant casualties within civilian population. I think it's also important to mention that there is not only a military option being pursued in Cabo Delgado. Not, I would say, apart from public eyes, a number of efforts have been conducted at a very high level, both in the Middle East and also in Cabo Delgado, in terms of trying to engage relevant elements in order to end the war and the violence. So I would say that the military option is being combined with a political element, which is to find grounds to, I think it's too much to say a negotiated settlement, but those contacts are being made and developed in order to achieve a solution for the conflict of Cabo Delgado. As you know, there is a Frelimo candidate that it should be the would-be president in January, and he already went up to Kigali to discuss Cabo Delgado with Paul Kagame. So these things have been accommodated, and all these efforts, military and political efforts in relation to Cabo Delgado, have been shared with major investors in the gas industry and related to Cabo Delgado. I would say, and I'm about to finish. Those initiatives, especially the military initiatives, cannot be replaced by other actions by the Mozambican government addressing its social and economic issues in Cabo Delgado, and also the present and ongoing training of Mozambican military forces should reach a stage in which then the presence of Rwandan forces can be evaluated. But for the time being, I think it will be too early for Rwanda to withdraw from Mozambique and return back to their home country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fernando. And I want to thank everybody for their insightful explanations of the trade-offs in this very complex situation. Fernando actually answered a number of the questions in the chat at the moment, especially about the capabilities of the Mozambican security architecture to survive post both Rwanda and SADC. And we are slightly over time. So I'm going to thank everybody while saying that we will address all questions by email. Please feel free to email us directly. And then, of course, we can pass it on if it needs to go any further. But I would like to thank both Lad and Peter for their presentations and also, of course, for writing the report, which was very interesting. Alex, for introducing us to these many issues that are starting to pervade the continent and certainly are not going to be things of the past as we move forward. I've really enjoyed the chat. I hope that everybody else had. We've had a very large audience and a very active chat, and we hope to get to those questions as soon as we get them over email. And thank you very much to both, of course, Gina and Eva for setting this up for us to do. Thanks again, everybody.